The day Frances Doyle rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she arrived with a rifle across her lap, a bruise yellowing beneath her left eye, and the absolute certainty that she would never again trust a man who smiled at her first. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a wound that hadn't quite healed, a cattle town full of drovers and saloon keepers and men who thought the frontier gave them permission to be lesser versions of themselves. The main street was a river of mud from 3 days of steady rain, and the buildings on either side leaned into each other like old drunks, holding themselves up out of habit more than structural integrity. Frances pulled her roan mare to a slow walk through that mud and kept her eyes forward and her chin level, the way her father had taught her before whiskey took him and left her with nothing but the rifle and the lesson. She had come from Wichita, 40 miles northeast, having spent the last 2 years managing the books for a man named Harlan Webb, who ran a dry goods operation and called himself a businessman. Harlan Webb had also called himself a reasonable man, a patient man, a Christian man, and then one Tuesday evening when she had informed him that she had discovered significant discrepancies in his accounts that pointed to fraud against his suppliers, he had demonstrated that he was none of those things. The bruise under her eye was his argument. Her departure on the mare she had bought with her own wages was her reply. She had no plan beyond Caldwell. She had heard there was work there, and that the cattle drives coming up from Texas made the town busy enough that a woman who could read and write and calculate figures could find honest employment. She had $32 sewn into the lining of her coat, and the kind of resolve that comes not from optimism but from having already survived the worst version of your own life. The first place she stopped was a boarding house on the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, run by a wide woman named Gertie Marsh, who took one look at Frances and her bruise and her rifle and said, $1.50 a week. No men pass the front parlor. Breakfast at 6, supper at 7. You miss it, you go hungry. That suits me fine, Frances said. You running from something. Most people out here are running from something. Gertie considered this and then nodded, which was as close to philosophy as she was willing to go, and showed Frances to a room on the second floor that was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the stable behind the building. Frances spent her first evening sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, not unpacking, just sitting in the particular stillness of a person who has been in motion for so long that stopping feels dangerous. She ate the cold supper Gertie left outside her door without tasting it. She slept with the rifle within arm's reach and woke twice in the night convinced she heard footsteps in the hall, which turned out to be the house settling in the cooling air. In the morning she went looking for work. The land office had no use for her. The telegraph office already had a man. The mercantile on the corner of Kishom and 2nd was run by a red-faced man named Potts, who looked at her chest before he looked at her face and told her he didn't think she'd be comfortable in a working environment, which was a sentence so absurd that she almost laughed before walking out. There was a bank that accepted her inquiry politely and promised to pass it along to no one. There was a saloon called the Meridian that offered her a position she declined without elaborating. By midday she was standing on the corner feeling the specific despair of a competent person being told by incompetent people that she was not needed, when she noticed the sign on a narrow building wedged between a harness shop and a lawyer's office. The sign read, Keene Freight and Hauling, established 1876, honest rates. She did not know what drew her to it. Perhaps it was the modesty of the sign, the plain letters, and the lack of ornamentation that characterized every other business on the street trying to perform prosperity it didn't quite have. Perhaps it was the word honest, which she had been thinking about a great deal lately. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled of sawdust and ledger ink. There were crates stacked along one wall and maps pinned to another, routes marked in pencil across territorial Kansas and down into Indian Territory. A desk near the back was buried under papers, and behind the desk sat a man who was looking at one of those papers with the concentrated frown of someone doing arithmetic in his head and not loving the answer. He looked up when she entered. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had last met a razor several days ago. His eyes were the color of river water in late autumn, a gray-green that was neither one thing nor another, and they assessed her quickly and without particular judgment, moving from her face to her rifle to her face again. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for work," Frances said. "I can manage accounts, keep ledgers, write correspondence, calculate freight rates, and organize records. I noticed your desk and concluded that you might have some need of those services." The man looked at his desk. There was a pause long enough to be honest. "I'm Owen Keene," he said. "This is my operation, Frances Doyle." He stood, which she had not expected, and came around the desk and offered his hand, which she also had not expected. She shook it. "You have experience with freight?" he asked. "No, but I have experience with accounts, and freight involves accounts." "Fair point." He looked at the desk again. "I've been keeping the books myself since my last man left in February. They are not in a state I'm proud of. I can see that from here." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "You're direct. I find it saves time. What happened to your eye?" It was a blunt question, and she respected it more than she would have respected a careful one. "My previous employer disagreed with my accounting," she said. "I disagreed with his method of expressing disagreement. I left." Owen Keene was quiet for a moment. She watched him carefully, looking for the calculation that men often performed in that pause, the one where they decided whether a woman with a bruised eye was more interesting or more trouble. She had learned to read that calculation like a weather sign. What she saw instead was simply a man deciding something, and then deciding it. "$20 a day," he said. "You start tomorrow, I'll have the ledgers out for you." "I'll start now," she said, "if that suits you." He looked at the desk and then back at her. "It suits me." She hung her coat on the hook behind the door and sat down at his desk and began to sort his papers into piles. And Owen Keene leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and watched her for a moment before he seemed to realize he was staring and went to the back of the building to inventory a load of hardware that was heading south on Thursday. She worked until the light failed. The ledgers were, as he had suggested, not in a state anyone should be proud of. They were not dishonest, she determined quickly, just disordered in the way that a busy, solitary man's records tended to become when he had too many things to track and not enough patience for the rows and columns that held them in place. There were unpaid invoices mixed with paid ones, freight manifests filed under the wrong dates, and a running tally of operating costs that had not been updated since January. It would take her most of a week to properly reconstruct the current state of the business, but she could already see the shape of it, a lean operation, honestly run, that was surviving on narrow margins and the kind of personal reputation that required Owen Keene to be reliable enough that people kept coming back. He came back to the front of the building at dusk and found her still working and said, "You don't have to stay." "I know," she said, without looking up. He went out and came back 20 minutes later with 2 tin cups of coffee from the diner 2 doors down, and set one on the desk beside her without comment. She drank it without comment. They did not speak again for another hour, and when she finally put down the pen and straightened the stack of papers she had been sorting, she felt the odd, specific piece of work honestly done. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," he agreed. She took her coat and her rifle and walked back through the darkened street to Gertie Marsh's boarding house, and she told herself that she was glad only about the work. The rest of it, the coffee, the lack of comment about her working late, the way he had not once looked at her with that particular calculating expression, none of that was relevant to anything. The town of Caldwell in those days existed in a state of barely managed chaos. The cattle season was beginning to peak, and the Kishom Trail brought Texas longhorns north through Indian Territory and into Caldwell before the herds pushed on toward Wichita or the railheads further east. The drovers who came with the herds were young men mostly, burning with the energy of weeks on the trail and the sudden availability of whiskey and company. And the town's two deputy sheriffs, both of them overworked and underpaid, spent most of their time managing the consequences. Frances observed all of this from the window of the freight office and the path between the office and the boarding house, and she navigated it with the particular efficiency of a woman who has learned to move through male-dominated spaces without inviting conversation. She kept her expression neutral and her pace purposeful, and her rifle visible enough to function as a social signal. Within her first week, she had reorganized Keene Freight's accounts into a system she could maintain, recovered 3 unpaid invoices totaling $47 that Owen apparently had not chased because he disliked confrontation with clients he liked, and drafted a standard freight rate schedule that would replace the ad hoc pricing he had been doing in his head. Owen accepted all of these improvements with the same uncomplicated gratitude he gave everything she did, directly, without excessive praise, and without any suggestion that he was surprised a woman could manage figures. She respected this about him the same way she respected the bluntness of his questions and the plainness of his sign. He was not performing generosity. He was simply treating her work as work. She did not let herself think more than that about him. On the 8th day of her employment, a man named Calhoun came into the office looking for Owen. Calhoun ran cattle for a ranching outfit from down south and had a manner that suggested he had gone through life expecting rooms to rearrange themselves for him. He was 40-something with a face like cured leather and eyes that moved over Frances the way a man's hand moves over a table, not looking at what it touches, but not quite not looking either. "Where's Keene?" he said. "He is out arranging a pickup on the North Road," Frances said. "He expects to return this afternoon. I can take a message or schedule an appointment." "I don't need to make an appointment with a freight man," Calhoun said. "Then I expect you can wait outside," Frances said. Calhoun's eyebrows went up. "What you say to me?" "I said that without an appointment, your option is to wait outside or return when Mr. Keene is back. Those are the available choices." There was a moment where Calhoun seemed to be recalculating something, the way men sometimes did when a woman refused to soften what she had said. Then he turned and walked out and stood on the boardwalk, and Frances returned to her work. When Owen came back an hour later and found Calhoun waiting, she heard them through the partially open door, Calhoun's voice loud and carrying, Owen's quiet. "Your woman in there got a mouth on her," Calhoun said. "She's not my woman," Owen said. "She runs my office. She told you correct. Hell of a way to run a business." "My business runs fine," Owen said evenly. "Come in and tell me what you need." Frances kept her eyes on the ledger and said nothing when they came inside. Owen conducted the conversation with Calhoun with the precise, contained politeness of a man who does not particularly like someone but understands the professional necessity of dealing with them. He arranged the contract, shook Calhoun's hand and saw him out, and then he came to stand at the desk where Frances sat. "You all right?" he asked. "I am entirely fine," she said. "He can be unpleasant." "Yes, many men can be." Owen was quiet for a moment. "I imagine you've had considerable experience with that." "Considerable," she agreed. He nodded once, as if that confirmed something, and went back to his own work. She was aware, distantly, of the way the exchange had felt different from most conversations she had with men who were nominally in authority over her. There had been no apology on Calhoun's behalf, no suggestion that she should have been more accommodating, no performance of rescue. He had simply said that she had told Calhoun correctly and moved on. She put it away in the same place she put the coffee and the lack of staring, and continued to not think about it. The weeks settled into a rhythm. She worked. She walked to and from the boarding house. She took Sunday mornings to write letters to her younger sister Clara, who was living in St. Louis with an aunt and working in a textile shop, and saving money with the admirable patience of a person who has learned that waiting for the right thing is better than accepting the wrong thing quickly. Frances did not write to anyone else. There was no one else. Owen Keene had a helper, a young man of 17 named Thomas who did the physical hauling and drove the wagon, and had a habit of looking at Frances with the open, uncomplicated admiration of a boy who has not yet learned to make that look complicated. She was not unkind to Thomas. She gave him tasks when he was underfoot, and answered his questions about the accounts when he asked them, and occasionally made sure there was an extra portion of coffee when he came in cold from an early run. One afternoon in late April, when the warm weather had begun to push the mud back into dust on the main street, Thomas was helping her move a stack of crates to reach a file cabinet at the back of the office when he said, entirely without preamble, "Mr. Keene is the best man I know." Frances paused with a crate in her arms. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am. He gave me work when my father passed and my mother didn't have anything. He didn't make a show of it either. Just said there was work available if I wanted it." Thomas pushed the last crate aside. "Most men around here make a show." "Most men do," Frances agreed. She put the crate down and opened the file cabinet and did not say anything more about it, but she carried it with her the way she carried the other small things that were assembling themselves into a picture she was not yet willing to look at directly. The complication arrived on a Thursday in early May. A man named Ridley turned up at the freight office with two other men who had the particular loose, lounging quality of people who are used to being the ones who make situations uncomfortable rather than the ones who endure them. Ridley was perhaps Owen's age, with pale eyes and a smile that knew something you didn't. He said he had a freight proposal that required discussion. Owen was out. Frances was alone except for Thomas, who was in the back stacking supplies. "Mr. Keene is away," she said. "You can leave the details of your proposal and he will contact you." "I'd rather discuss it directly," Ridley said. He sat down without being invited in the chair across from her desk. His two companions stood near the door. "I'm sure a capable woman like yourself can hear out a proposal." Frances put down her pen. She had a particular stillness when she was wary, not a tense stillness but a gathered one, like a river narrowing before it speeds up. "What is the proposal?" "There are goods coming through the territory that need discreet transport, no questions asked, significantly more profitable than standard freight rates." Frances looked at him for a long moment. "And by discreet you mean illegal," Ridley smiled. "I mean private." "This is not that kind of operation," she said. "I would ask you to leave." "Maybe let Keene decide that for himself. Mr. Keene's values are reflected in how he runs his business. I do not believe he needs to hear this in person to have the same answer." Ridley leaned forward slightly. "You seem very certain about what Keene thinks." "I am certain about what this ledger reflects," she said, "which is a business built on honest work. Take your proposal elsewhere." The smile stayed on Ridley's face, but something behind it cooled. He stood up slowly. "We'll come back. You will receive the same answer." When they left, she found that her hands were steady but her pulse was not, and she sat for a moment just breathing before she wrote down everything she remembered about Ridley's description and the nature of the proposal, because she had also learned that the things you write down immediately are the things you remember correctly later. When Owen returned that afternoon, she gave him the account word for word. He read the note she had made and then looked up at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "You told them no." "I did." "Good." He set the note down. "You were right about what this operation is. He will not get a different answer from me." "I know," she said. And she did know, which was in itself an odd thing because she was not in the habit of knowing things about men with any confidence. "I should also tell you that they may be trouble." They did not take it gracefully. Owen considered this. "I'll speak to the deputies." "I already sent Thomas with a note to Deputy Alcott while you were out." Owen looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. A small, unmistakable thing, like a door opened slightly into a room full of light. "Thank you," he said. "It was practical," she said. Still, he did not say anything more, but he looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked back, and then they both returned to their work. Ridley and his men came back 2 days later, this time when Owen was present, and the conversation was short and conclusive. Owen told them in plain terms that Keene Freight did not carry illegal goods, had no interest in changing that policy, and that they had been identified to the local law already. Ridley's smile did not waver, but the three men left, and Frances watched from her desk as Owen stood in the doorway a moment after they had gone, looking down the street with the calm, contained readiness of a man who has already calculated the possibilities and decided what he will do about each one. She thought about that for a long time that evening, sitting in her room at Gertie's. She thought about readiness as a form of honesty. She thought about the specific texture of a person who is what they say they are. She told herself she was thinking about nothing particular and went to sleep. The cattle drives pushed the pace of everything in Caldwell up another notch through May. Owen took on more contracts, which meant more work for both of them, and the days stretched long and closed together in a way that had its own particular quality, like the temperature in a room that has been occupied by two people working in comfortable silence for a long time. She was aware of him in the way you become aware of a reliable thing, not dramatically, but constantly. The sound of his boots, the way he frowned when he was calculating, the particular way he said her name, Frances, without the diminutive, without abbreviating her into something more convenient. One evening in late May, he stayed past the usual hour because there was a complicated consignment coming in from Dodge City, and the manifest needed to be reconciled before morning. She stayed too, because the manifest was her domain, and because she had nowhere particular to be. They worked in the quiet that had become natural between them, and at some point well past supper she realized she was hungry and said so, and he went out and came back with bread and cold beef from the diner and 2 more tin cups of coffee, and they ate at the desk surrounded by papers and did not speak for a long time, and it was entirely comfortable, which frightened her. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "You can ask." "Where are you going?" She looked up. "I beg your pardon. You're good at this work, better than good, and you're clear about what you want and don't want, which is not common. I'm wondering if Caldwell is a stop for you or if you intend to stay." She considered lying and then did not, because she had been honest with him from the beginning and she did not want to change that. "I did not have a plan beyond getting here," she said. "I needed work and I found it. I have not thought past that." "Fair enough," he said. He looked at his coffee. "I'm asking because I'd like you to stay, for the work I mean. You've made this operation more functional in 6 weeks than it was in the 3 years before." "For the work," she repeated. "Yes," he said, and then, after a beat, "mostly." She looked at him. He was looking at the coffee cup with a concentrated attention that it did not particularly warrant, and she understood that this was what honesty looked like on a man who was not accustomed to saying the harder thing. She recognized it because she had the same difficulty herself. "I have not been looking for anything beyond work," she said carefully. He nodded slowly. "I'm not trying to complicate your situation. What are you trying to do?" He looked up then directly at her and the gray-green eyes were steady. "I honestly don't know yet," he said. "I'm just being straight with you." She held that for a long moment. Then she said, "I can stay for the work. The rest of it I cannot promise anything about." "That's honest," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They finished the manifest and she went back to Gertie's and she lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the distant sound of the Meridian's piano and thinking about the word mostly, turning it over like a coin. June brought heat and dust, and a rhythm that Frances had begun to think of, carefully, as hers. The work expanded into new routes. Owen was developing south toward the territorial border, and she negotiated 2 new contracts with local businesses that brought in steadier income than the cattle season surges, and she took a measure of satisfaction in that which was purely professional and entirely genuine. She also noticed things that she did not note in any ledger. She noticed that Owen Keene never raised his voice, not to Thomas, not to difficult clients, not to the suppliers who were sometimes late or short on stock. She noticed that he knew the names of the people he dealt with, not just the men who ran businesses, but the women who kept those businesses running in the background, the way she did. She noticed that when he negotiated, he was fair in a way that was almost inefficient, that he could have extracted better terms from some of the smaller suppliers but did not, because he understood that a margin that was only advantageous to him was a margin that would eventually create resentment and fail. She noticed that he treated the Osage men who sometimes passed through on their way to and from the territory with the same directness and courtesy he gave everyone else, at a time when plenty of men in Caldwell did not. And she noticed that he said nothing about this, that it was not performed for anyone's benefit but simply how he was. She was building a case against herself, and she knew it. On a hot afternoon in mid-June, she was alone in the office when a woman she did not know came in. A woman of perhaps 50 with a sharp, discerning face and Owen's gray-green eyes. She looked at Frances the way people look at things they have already been told about and are now checking against the description. "You must be Frances Doyle," the woman said. "I am," Frances said, "and you must be related to Owen." The woman almost smiled. "Owen Keene, his mother. I'm visiting from Wichita." "He mentioned you would be coming," Frances said. "He is out at the North Depot but will be back by 3. Owen Keene sat down in the chair across from the desk with the ease of someone who sits wherever she likes. She looked around the office at the organized files, the neat ledgers, the rate schedule on the wall. "Owen wrote me that he had hired someone who had transformed the operation," she said. "I organized it," Frances said. "The operation was already good." Owen considered this. "He also said you were perceptive." "He is perceptive himself." There was a pause. Owen Keene was, Frances determined, a woman who used silence the way a good gambler uses a pause to see what fills it. Frances declined to fill it. "How do you find Caldwell?" Owen asked. "Manageable," Frances said. "The work is good. The town is not the worst I have been in." "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri. I've been west for 3 years." "On your own?" "Yes," Owen nodded. "That takes something," she said simply, without the excessive admiration that was sometimes condescension wearing different clothes. "It takes being unwilling to do the alternative," Frances said. When Owen came back at 3 and found his mother sitting across from Frances, both of them working on the accounts he had asked Frances to prepare for the quarterly summary, he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that Frances catalogued privately as a man who has been neatly surprised by 2 people he values finding each other naturally. "You found each other," he said. "Your employee is excellent," Owen said. "I've been helping her with the quarterly figures." "She doesn't need help," Owen said. "No," Owen agreed. "But I was useful anyway." That evening Owen's mother took them both to supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best restaurant in Caldwell and served actual tablecloths, and the 3 of them sat together for 2 hours and talked with the ease of people who share a respect for directness and a general skepticism about pretension. Frances found herself laughing twice, genuinely, at things Owen said about the state of Wichita, and she noticed Owen watching her when she laughed with an expression she put carefully away. After supper, Owen walked back to the hotel and Owen walked Frances back toward Gertie's, which was the first time he had done this, and they walked for half a block in comfortable quiet before he said, "She likes you." "She is very direct," Frances said. "She is. It's something she passed on." Frances looked sideways at him. He was walking with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes forward, and the warm evening light made everything in Caldwell look briefly like it could be something better than it was. "Your mother seems to think well of you," she said. "She's biased," he said. "Probably, but the evidence seems to support her assessment." He glanced at her. "Was that a compliment, Frances Doyle?" "It was an accounting," she said. "I deal in facts." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, quietly, "You don't have to account for everything." She stopped walking. They were in front of the boarding house now, and the night was warm, and the street was not entirely empty, but it was quiet enough. She looked at him in the way she had been careful not to look at him, directly and without the professional distance she had been maintaining. "I am not looking for kindness," she said. "I want you to know that. I did not come here looking for someone to be kind to me." He looked at her steadily. There was something in his face that was not a smile and was not neutrality but something in between, something warm and careful and entirely his own. "I'm not offering kindness," he said. She blinked. "Then what are you offering?" "Myself," he said. "And those are different things." She stood with that for a moment in the warm June dark, in the cattle town street with the smell of dust and wood smoke and the distant piano from the saloon. She stood with it the way she stood with figures she was trying to understand, giving them the space to become clear. "Different how?" she asked. He seemed to consider how to say it. "Kindness is something you do for someone because they need it or because it makes you feel like a decent person. What I am offering is not about what you need or what I get from it. It is just that I want you to know I am here. That is all. I am not asking anything." The street was quiet around them. A horse moved somewhere in the dark. The piano played on. Frances Doyle had spent 3 years building walls out of necessity and maintaining them out of habit, and she had become very good at both. And she knew the exact weight of what she was considering doing now, which was the specific and dangerous act of standing in the presence of a good man and not walking away from it. "I do not know how to do this," she said, not an excuse, a fact. "Neither do I particularly," he said. "I have not done it well before." "What happened?" "A woman in Wichita 3 years ago. She wanted someone who was more settled in one place and I wanted a freight route. We were both honest about it and she married a lawyer and I came south and opened this business. No tragedy, just different things." She appreciated the plainness of it, the absence of self-pity or blame in either direction. "I was not with anyone in Wichita," she said, "because it felt like the honest equivalent. I was just working for a man who turned out to be dishonest and then violent." "I know," he said. "You told me the first day. I suppose I did. I remember everything you've told me," he said, and it was said so simply that it landed with more weight than a declaration because it was not a declaration but a fact, which was his way. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Good night, Owen." "Good night, Frances." She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the difference between kindness and a person, about what it meant to be offered the one rather than the other. She decided to think about it more in the morning. But she already knew, in the way you know a sum before you have finished working it through, what the answer was going to be. July came in with the particular ferocity that Kansas summer days have, dry and hard and bright as a coin in the noon sun. The cattle drives were at their peak, and Caldwell was as crowded and loud as it got, and Keene freight was running 3 routes simultaneously, which meant that Owen was often out on the road while Frances managed the office and Thomas made the local deliveries. What had changed between Owen and Frances was not dramatic, and was not announced, and was not different in any observable way from the outside. It was a degree of directness that had always been there, now with something additional underneath it, an awareness, a small, steady warmth that sat alongside the work like a companion. He brought her coffee still, but now sometimes she brought it to him when she arrived first, and neither of them commented on the reciprocity. He had begun telling her about problems on the routes before he made decisions about them, not asking her to solve them, but simply thinking aloud in her presence, which she understood to be a form of trust. She had begun doing the same, saying the things she was working out about the accounts or the contracts before they were finished thoughts, which was not something she did with anyone. One afternoon in mid-July, Ridley reappeared. Not in the freight office this time, but on the street as she was walking back from the post office. He fell into step beside her in the way men do when they want to make a point about taking up space. "Still working for Keene," he said. "Still," she said, without altering her pace. "He know what he's got in that office. He knows I am competent," she said, "which is all that is professionally relevant. I'm talking about something else." She stopped and faced him. "I know what you're talking about," she said, "and I am telling you that it is not relevant in any context. Leave me alone." Ridley looked at her with those pale eyes and that smile that knew something you didn't. "You're a long way from home, Frances Doyle." "I am precisely where I intend to be," she said, and she turned and walked away with her back straight and her pace unhurried, which was harder than it looked. She told Owen that evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you want me to speak to him?" "No," she said. "I handled it. I am telling you because it is relevant to the business and because I do not keep things from you." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me. I'll let Alcott know." "I already sent Thomas," she said. He looked at her, and the thing she had been cataloging for weeks was present in his expression, clear and uncomplicated. "Of course you did," he said. "Owen," she said. "Yes. I have been thinking about what you said. In June, outside the boarding house." He became very still in the way he became still when something mattered. "I think," she said carefully, because she had worked out exactly what she wanted to say and wanted to say it exactly, "that I understand the difference now, between the thing you said you were offering and the thing you said you were not." And his voice was level, but she knew him well enough to hear the thing underneath it. "And I would like to accept what you are offering," she said. "Whatever that looks like, given that neither of us knows how to do this particularly well." He stood up from his desk and came around it and stood in front of her, not close enough to be presumptuous but close enough that she could see his eyes clearly, and they were warm and steady and entirely themselves. "I don't know how to do it well," he said, "but I can promise you honest." "That is worth more than skilled," she said. He reached out and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, but with the same directness that characterized everything he did. A simple, deliberate taking of her hand in both of his, and she let him, and her heart made the specific, terrifying decision to be in this room. "Sunday," he said. "Will you walk with me?" "Yes," she said. They walked on Sunday along the creek south of town, where the cottonwoods were thick, and the cattle noise was distant, and the morning was cool enough to be pleasant. They talked the way they always talked, directly about real things. About his father, who had run a small dry goods store in Ohio, and his mother's iron practicality, and the decision he had made at 22 to come west with a wagon and an idea, and about her father's drinking and her mother's early death and the sister in St. Louis and the years of managing other people's affairs while managing none of her own. "Do you want things for yourself?" he asked. Not unkindly. Genuinely. She thought about it. "I used to want less than I let myself want," she said. "It felt safer. And now I think that wanting things is not the dangerous part. The dangerous part is wanting them from people who will misuse it." She looked at the water moving over the stones. "I do not think you will misuse it." "I will not," he said, with a certainty that was not boastful but simply true. They walked back to town in the late morning heat with the comfort of people who have said the important things and do not need to fill the silence with lesser ones. August was its own season, full and complicated. Thomas's mother fell ill, and Owen gave the boy 2 weeks with pay to go see to her, and Frances held the office alone with the help of a temporary driver Owen hired for the route work. She found she was capable of running the entire operation independently, which was satisfying in a way she had not quite expected, not because she needed to prove it, but because knowing it changed something in her understanding of herself. Owen courted her with the same plainness that characterized everything else about him. He brought her things he thought she would find useful or interesting: a better pen when the old one wore out, a book of territorial maps that she could use for route planning, and that she suspected he had sourced specifically, because she had mentioned offhand that she liked to understand the geography of the places she worked. He asked her opinion on business decisions in a way that made clear he valued it, not as a performance of respect, but as actual consultation. He sat beside her at supper at the hotel when his mother extended her visit, and the three of them together had an ease that felt like a thing already established rather than a thing being constructed. He kissed her for the first time in late August, on the evening after they had resolved a contract dispute with a particularly difficult client from Abilene, when the relief of having navigated something complicated together was still in the air between them. They were standing in the office in the last light, and she turned to say something about the letter she was going to draft, and he was right there, closer than she had realized, and the question in his eyes was entirely visible and entirely patient. She kissed him first, because she was Frances Doyle and she did not wait for other people to do the necessary thing. He kissed her back with the same quality of everything else about him, steady, genuine, and without any pretense about what it was. She was 30 years old and had not been kissed in 4 years and had told herself she was not particularly interested in being kissed again, and she was revising that position substantially. "Good," she said when they stepped back, and he laughed, and it was the best sound she had heard in years, and she laughed too, which surprised her. September brought cooling nights and the end of the cattle season, and a particular quality of clarity that the autumn plains had when the heat broke and the sky deepened its color. The pace at the freight office slowed to the more manageable rhythm of the off-season, and Frances used the time to plan the expansion she had been thinking about since July. She laid it out for Owen one afternoon, a third permanent route into Indian Territory that could carry legal goods to the trading posts there, which were underserved by existing freight operators and represented a genuine opportunity. She had the numbers to support it, the costs, the projected income, the time required to establish the relationships. She had also, characteristically, already identified 2 of the trading post operators she thought would be receptive to a preliminary conversation. Owen listened to all of it and then said, "I know these 2 men, they're honest." "I know," she said. "I asked around." "When did you start asking around?" "June," she said, "when I first thought of it." He looked at the figures she had laid out, then he looked at her. "You've been sitting on this since June." "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." "Frances," he said, with a particular quality in his voice that was not exasperation but something adjacent to tenderness, "this is your operation as much as mine at this point." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "it is your operation. I work for you." "That arrangement seems limited to me," he said. There was a pause. "What are you suggesting?" "Partnership," he said. "The legal kind, your name on the sign." She sat with this. "That is a significant proposition." "It is," he agreed. "Take your time with it." She took 3 days, during which she examined the business accounts, the existing contracts, the projected value of the expansion, and the general soundness of the operation. She also examined, with the same rigor, the question of what she wanted her life to contain, which was a question she had been avoiding asking directly for some time. On the 4th day she came into the office and said, "I accept the partnership on the condition that we formalize it with a legal contract that defines each party's rights and responsibilities clearly." "Obviously," he said, "and that the expansion route is included as a joint venture from the start." "Obviously," he said again. "Then yes," she said. He smiled at her, a full and genuine smile that she had been collecting since the first near smile on the first day, and she smiled back, and Thomas, who happened to be walking past the open door at that moment, stopped and looked at both of them and then said, "Well, it's about time," and received identical looks from both of them that sent him quickly back to the wagon. October was the month that Ridley made his last approach, and it was not subtle. He came with 2 men on a Wednesday evening when the street was mostly quiet, and he came to the freight office where Owen and Frances were both still working, and it was not a conversation this time but a threat, delivered in the flat, specific language of men who had decided that persuasion had run its course. He wanted the 3rd route into the territory. He had goods to move that needed that route, goods he could not move through legal operators. He was prepared to make things difficult. Owen stood up from his desk. He was not a large man and he was not a violent man, but he had a quality in that moment that Frances had seen once before, when Ridley had first come around, that readiness she had noticed then, the calm, calculated sense of a person who has already worked out what he will do. "I am going to say this once," Owen said. "This route is a legal freight operation. It will remain a legal freight operation. If you bring trouble to this business, to this office, or to anyone connected with it, you will find that Deputy Alcott is already acquainted with your name and your operations in significant detail, because We have been providing that information since your first visit. I suggest you take your proposal to someone who is willing to take it." Ridley's pale eyes moved from Owen to Frances. "Your woman there have something to do with that." "Her name is Frances Doyle," Owen said, "and yes." Ridley looked at Frances for a long moment. She returned the look without expression. "This isn't finished," Ridley said. "For you it is," Owen said. "Good evening." After they left, Frances let out the breath she had been holding in a slow, controlled way. Owen stood at the door for a moment and then turned to look at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am fine," she said. "That was well handled. You looked completely calm." "I was not completely calm," she said. "I was managing the appearance of it. There is a difference." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk beside her, which was close, and looked at her carefully. "He is not going to be a problem much longer. Alcott has enough on him now." "I know," she said. She realized she was gripping the pen she had been holding rather tightly and set it down deliberately. "I have dealt with men like him before. It does not get easier exactly, but it becomes more manageable." Owen said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I hate that you've had to manage it." "I know," she said, "but it is not your fault." "No, but I hate it anyway." She looked at him. He was right there, solid and warm and genuinely angry on her behalf in the way that was not about him at all. Not about his pride or his authority, but simply about the fact that she had been required to endure things that should not have been required. And the specificity of that anger, how it was hers and not his, undid something in her that she had been keeping carefully assembled. "Owen," she said. "Yes. I think I love you." He was quiet. She watched his face go through something, a quick private passage of surprise and certainty and relief, and then he said, "I know I love you. You're more certain than I am." "I've been certain longer," he said. "You'll catch up." She looked at him, this plain, honest, river-eyed man who had offered her himself when she said she did not want anything. And she thought that catching up was probably not the right metaphor, that they were in fact in the same place already, had been for some time, and that she had simply been the last to read the ledger. She stood up and kissed him, and he held her in a way that was both gentle and entire, and the freight office was quiet around them, and the October wind moved through the gaps in the building, and it was the most located she had felt in years, possibly ever. Ridley was arrested in November. Alcott and the territorial marshal caught him and his men attempting to move stolen cattle through the territory using forged transit papers, and the case against him was thorough enough that he would not be troubling anyone in Caldwell or anywhere nearby for a considerable time. Frances heard the news from Thomas, who came in with it breathlessly, and she noted it in the margin of the day's ledger with a small, precise mark of satisfaction. Owen's mother returned to Wichita in late October and wrote Frances a letter shortly after that said, in Owen Keene's characteristic fashion, "I have not always found my son's judgment reliable in matters of the heart. In this matter I find it excellent." That was the whole letter. Frances read it twice and then put it in the top drawer of the desk where she kept things she wanted to keep. The partnership papers were signed in the first week of November before a lawyer named Beauchamp, who had an office 3 doors down from the freight office, and who had, over the preceding months, developed a mild professional admiration for Frances Doyle's precision with documents. The sign outside the building was replaced with a new one that Thomas helped Owen paint on a Sunday morning while Frances stood in the doorway with her coffee, and it said, "Keene and Doyle Freight. Established 1876. Honest rates." "You could put Doyle and Keene," Owen said. "Alphabetical order suggests Doyle first," she said, "but you were here first. You made it what it is." "We made it what it is," she said, which was true and which she meant. That winter Owen asked her to marry him. It was December, cold and gray and domestic, and they were sitting by the stove in the office after closing, reviewing the year's accounts together the way they always did at day's end, and he set down his papers and said, "Frances," and she looked up, and she knew from his face what was coming. "I am not doing this as a practical arrangement," he said, "though it is also practical. I'm doing it because you are the person I want to be in the world with, not because you are capable, though you are, not because you run this business better than I could alone, though that is also true, because of who you are when you are being yourself, which is the best thing I have ever had the privilege of being near." Frances set her own papers down. She had not thought she wanted this once. She had thought she was the kind of person for whom wanting it would always cost more than it returned, and she had built her life accordingly, efficiently and alone, and she had not been unhappy exactly, but she had been less than she now understood herself to be capable of, which was the specific discovery that another person's honest love makes possible. "Yes," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a plain silver band that was simple and elegant and entirely in keeping with everything about him. And he put it on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him and said, "This suits me." "Good," he said. "It suits you completely." They were married in February of 1880, in the small white church at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, which was the only church in town, and which Frances had attended exactly twice, both times for other people's events, and which Owen had attended with slightly more regularity. The minister was a short man named Garrett who performed the ceremony with a brisk sincerity that both of them appreciated. Owen Keene came from Wichita and sat in the front row with the satisfied expression of a woman whose assessment has been confirmed. Thomas stood up as Owen's witness with his hat in his hands, and his face composed with the exaggerated seriousness of a young man at an important occasion. The only other attendees were Gertie Marsh, who cried in an impressively contained fashion, Deputy Alcott, who came out of a respect for both of them that had developed over the Ridley affair, and Beauchamp the lawyer, who had grown fond of both of them in the way of a man who likes competent people. Frances wore her good gray dress because she did not have a wedding dress and did not see the point in acquiring one for a single occasion, and she pinned a small spray of dried wildflowers to her collar that Owen had brought from Wichita, and she carried nothing and needed nothing, and walked up the aisle to Owen Keene with her chin level and her eyes clear, and the absolute, sane certainty of a person who has made the right decision. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging since the first day, fully revealed now, entirely present, the warmth and steadiness and honest attention of a man who sees you clearly and chooses you knowing everything he sees. They said the words, they meant them. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at the hotel dining room, and Owen gave a toast that was 3 sentences long and said everything important. And Thomas gave a toast that was considerably longer, and said some things that were charming and some things that were inadvertently funny. And then the evening wound down into the February cold, and Frances and Owen walked back to the house on the west side of town that Owen had been renting for 2 years, and that now, by the logic of their joined lives, was both of theirs. It was a modest house, 4 rooms and a good stove and a view of the flat Kansas plains from the bedroom window, and Frances had been adding things to it gradually over the preceding weeks with the efficiency of someone who knows what a space needs. Curtains against the winter cold, a proper writing desk for the correspondence she took home sometimes, a second set of shelves for the books she had been accumulating, a kitchen arrangement that made sense. That night, in the quiet of their own house with the cold pressing against the windows and the stove warm in the kitchen, she lay awake in the dark thinking about the word theirs, and finding that it contained more than she had expected, that a word she had associated primarily with loss, because things that were yours together with the wrong person became weapons or ruins, could be reconstructed entirely by the right context. Owen was beside her, already asleep with the untroubled ease of a person with a clear conscience, and she listened to him breathe and looked at the ceiling and let herself want this, fully and without the protective hedging she had spent years maintaining around every good thing, and it was not terrifying in the way she had expected. It was the opposite of terrifying. She slept. Spring came, and with it the expansion route into the territory began to operate. The two trading post operators Owen had known were as receptive as Frances had predicted, and the first run south went smoothly, and the income they generated in the first 3 months exceeded her conservative projections. She was professionally pleased in a way that was also personally meaningful, because the route was hers in origin and her numbers had been right, and she had learned to let herself take satisfaction in that without diminishing it. Owen hired 2 additional drivers as the routes expanded, a man named Carver who had been driving supply wagons for the Army and preferred civilian work, and a man named Dutch who was quiet and reliable and could fix any mechanical problem a wagon presented him with. Frances made sure they were paid fairly and that the terms of their employment were clear and consistent, because she had been in enough working situations where the terms were ambiguous to know what that cost people. Thomas turned 18 in March and Owen gave him a formal wage increase and a route of his own, and Thomas received this with the straightforward pride of a young man who has been treated well and knows it. Frances gave him the leather-bound account book she had ordered from Dodge City because she intended to teach him the basics of route accounting, and this seemed like a good start. She wrote to Clara in St. Louis more frequently now, and Clara wrote back with the energetic affection of a younger sister who approved strongly of the change in her older sister's letters. Clara was doing well, saving money, considering moving west herself, asking questions about Caldwell and the territory with an interest that Frances recognized as more than casual. She invited Clara to visit in the summer. Clara wrote back an immediate yes. By midsummer of 1880, Frances knew she was carrying a child. She told Owen on a Tuesday evening, straightforwardly, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, because that was how she did things. She said, "I believe I am expecting a child. I have been to see the doctor and he confirmed it." Owen sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, and she watched his face the way she had learned to watch it, tracking the thing that moved through him slowly and settled into an expression she had no prior catalog for because she had never seen him look quite like that before. It was the face of a man receiving news that is both expected and still, somehow, entirely extraordinary. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Frances," he said, and then did not say anything more for a moment because some things do not require elaboration. "I know," she said. They sat like that for a while with the evening outside and the future inside, enormous and specific. "You feel well," he said finally. "I feel fine, a little tired. The doctor says everything is as it should be." "Good." He turned her hand over in his, looking at it. "You will tell me if you need anything." "I always tell you when I need things," she said. "More than usual, I mean." "Owen." "Yes. I am going to be entirely fine," she said. "And I intend to keep working as long as it is feasible to do so." "I know you do," he said, without any suggestion that this was surprising or needed his approval, which was why she had not hesitated to say it. "Good," she said. He looked up from her hand. "I am very happy," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see it. Are you happy?" She looked at him. This man she had walked into by accident on a day she had nothing and nowhere. This man who had offered her work and then himself and let her take both on her own terms. This man who had told her honestly and quietly that he loved her, and had meant it every day since in the specific, demonstrable way of a person who understands that love is not a thing you say once but a practice. "I am very happy," she said. "It surprised me how much." He brought her hand to his lips in a gesture that was entirely unlike him and entirely like him, and she let it be the thing it was. Their son was born in January of 1881, in the coldest week of a cold winter, with a leaner Keene present and a competent midwife named Mrs. Holt, who had delivered most of Caldwell's babies for the preceding decade. The birth was hard and long, and Frances endured it with the characteristic set of her jaw, and the complete absence of any impulse to pretend it was less than it was. Owen sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours, and Thomas, who happened to be in the house when it began, sat with him for most of that time saying nothing, which was the correct thing to do. The baby was healthy and loud, and had Frances's dark eyes and Owen's general disposition, which seemed unfair in the sense that a calm, agreeable baby might suggest that the difficulty of getting him here had not been entirely serious. They named him James, after Owen's father, who had died of a fever in Ohio the year Owen came west. Frances held him that first evening while Owen sat beside her on the bed, and Alina sat in the chair by the window pretending to read but not reading, and Caldwell was very quiet outside in the frozen January night, and James Owen Keene was 8 hours old and entirely himself. "He is perfect," Owen said. "He is loud," Frances said, but she was looking at the baby with an expression she could not have described and would not have tried. "Both can be true," Alina said from the chair without looking up from her book. They could. The years that followed had the quality of a life being genuinely lived rather than survived, which was different enough from what Frances had known before to be continuously remarkable. The freight business grew steadily, not dramatically, but with the kind of sustainable momentum that honest work and good relationships produce over time. By 1882, they had 4 routes operating and 5 employees, and Keene and Doyle Freight had a reputation that extended from Caldwell through the territory and up to Wichita that was built entirely on reliability and fair dealing. Frances continued to manage the accounts and the contracts and the expansion planning, and she had also, by this point, begun to take on some of the negotiation work that Owen had always handled alone, not because he could not manage it, but because she was good at it, and because it made sense to divide it, and also because she found that she liked the negotiation, the precision of it. The way that finding a fair arrangement required you to understand both parties' actual needs, rather than their stated positions. Clara came to visit in the summer of 1881 and stayed 3 months, working in the office alongside Frances and charming Thomas to a degree that was immediately obvious to everyone in the building. Clara was 23 and practical and funny in a way that was different from Frances's particular variety of practicality, warmer and more expansive, and she and Thomas had conversations that began professionally and then went long into the evenings, and by the end of the 3 months, something had been established that required no further engineering. Clara went back to St. Louis and Thomas wrote her letters, which Frances addressed because his handwriting was useful for route documentation and less useful for correspondence. By the summer of 1882, Clara had moved to Caldwell, and she and Thomas were married in the same small white church where Owen and Frances had married, with the same minister and the same hotel supper after, and the added guests of the employees and the neighbors who had accumulated around both families in the intervening years. Frances stood beside Owen at the wedding and held James on her hip, 14 months old and already fascinated by anything that moved, and watched her sister become happy in a way that had a similar shape to her own happiness but was entirely Clara's own. And she thought about the years between her mother's death and this day, the long, difficult middle of it, and felt a gratitude so specific and complete that it was almost physically present. Owen put his arm around her during the ceremony, and she leaned into it by such a small degree that no one else could have noticed, and he felt it and was quiet and present beside her, and James reached up and took a fistful of Owen's jacket, because James did this to Owen constantly. Some fundamental pull toward his father that manifested in grabbing, and Owen looked down at the baby with the same expression he had been making since the night James was born. That uncatalogued face of a man for whom the world has become larger than expected. By 1883, Frances was expecting again. She told Owen in the kitchen on a Tuesday again because she was consistent. He received it with the same extraordinary ordinary joy he had the first time, and she found that it was not less remarkable for being repeated. He held her in the kitchen with the easy sureness of a man who has been holding someone long enough that it is second nature, but has not lost the deliberateness of it. Their daughter arrived in November of 1883, fast and fierce and opinionated from the first hour, and they named her a leaner for Owen's mother, who received this information in a letter and responded in 3 sentences. "This is well done. She will be magnificent. Do not let her be otherwise." Owen Keene the younger was, from the beginning, as her grandmother predicted, loud, curious, physically fearless, and in possession of a will that Frances recognized as her own, but in a larger and less constrained version, which was how she intended to keep it. James was 3 when his sister arrived, and handled her with the solemn protective care of a child who understands that something important has been added to his world without quite being able to say how he knows. The house, which had seemed adequate and sometimes small, was rearranged to accommodate all of them and felt, after the rearrangement, larger rather than smaller, which was the particular math of a family that is doing well. Owen hired a 3rd driver in the spring of 1884, and Frances completed the expansion south that had been in planning for 2 years, the one that required the relationship with the Osage trading post operators that she had been cultivating carefully and honestly since 1882, treating them with the same direct respect she treated everyone she worked with. The route was challenging and occasionally complicated by territorial politics that shifted with the federal government's inconsistent treatment of the 5 civilized tribes and the Osage in particular. And Frances was not naive about those complications, about the fundamental injustice of the system that constrained the people she was dealing with. But she made her own practice one of honest dealing and fair rates, and showed up reliably, which was what she could control. One of the Osage traders, a man named Walks with Rain who spoke excellent English and had a sharp business mind, said to her once when they were discussing the route terms that she was the only freight operator who had not attempted to reduce the rate for territory deliveries based on the assumption that they could get away with it. "That would not be honest," she said. "No," he said, "but many are not." "I know," she said. "We are." They shook hands and the route continued, and she noted it as a fact in her ledger and did not make more of it than it was, though it was not nothing. In 1885, Caldwell was changing. The cattle drives that had defined the town's economy were beginning to shift as the Kansas open range gave way to fencing, and the railroad network expanded, and the nature of the frontier itself evolved under the pressure of settlement and law. The chaos of the early cattle-town years was becoming something else, not exactly civilized but differently organized, and Keene and Doyle Freight adapted with it, shifting more of their operations toward the commercial and agricultural supply routes that the growing homestead communities needed. Frances was 36 by then, and when she looked at the business she had helped build and the life she inhabited with Owen and their children, she recognized it as something that had come from work that was hers in origin and ongoing, not a thing that had happened to her, but a thing she had made. Owen said to her one evening, sitting on the porch of the house in the September cool while the children slept inside and the plain stretched out enormous and quiet to the west, "Are you glad you stayed?" She considered this, not because she was uncertain, but because she respected the question enough to give it proper consideration. "Yes," she said. "Though that is not quite the right way to put it. How would you put it?" "I am glad I let myself want what I found here," she said. "The staying was simple once I did that." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the plains. Then he said, "You told me once you were not looking for kindness. I remember. Do you still think that?" She looked at him in the September dark, the man who had offered her himself as a different thing, who had made good on that distinction every day since in ways that were sometimes large and sometimes so small you had to be paying close attention to see them, and who had been paying exactly that kind of attention to her in return. "I was right," she said. "I was not looking for kindness. Kindness would not have been enough." He turned to look at her with that face, the warm and steady and entirely honest face of a person who sees you clearly, and she looked back with the same, because she had learned it from him and from herself and from the specific education of being genuinely loved. "You gave me something worth more," she said. every day. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, and the plains were vast and the night was cool, and their children slept inside the house they had made. And Frances Doyle Keene sat with her husband on the porch of their life and felt, as she had been feeling for years now with an astonishment that did not diminish, the full and specific weight of having been right to want this. Thomas and Clara had their first child in 1884, a boy they named Will, and their second in 1886, a girl called May, and the two families were close in the way of people whose lives are genuinely intertwined rather than simply adjacent. Sundays brought them together frequently. Children underfoot and supper on the large table Owen had built in the spring of 1884, when it became clear that the original one was no longer adequate. James started school in 1887 and proved to be his mother's son in the matter of arithmetic and his father's son in the matter of patience. And Alina, at 4, was already attempting to understand things several years ahead of her ostensible comprehension, which everyone around her had simply learned to accommodate. She would climb into Frances's lap, while Frances worked the accounts and follow the pen with her eyes, and occasionally ask questions that were 4 years old in vocabulary and considerably older in acuity. And Frances answered them all completely, because she believed in the principle of answering the question that was actually being asked. Owen taught James to drive the small wagon when the boy was 6, which Frances observed from the office window with the calm of a woman who trusts her husband's judgment, and also cannot quite believe how large their son is already. Owen taught him with the same patient directness he brought to everything, not doing it for the boy but showing him, and then letting him try and then correcting specifically when correction was needed, and James took to it with a seriousness that was very him. In 1888, Alina Keene the elder, Owen's mother, died quietly in Wichita after a brief illness. She had written Frances 2 weeks before, a longer letter than her usual, 3 pages that said the things she wanted said clearly and without sentimentality, about what she thought of Owen and what she thought of Frances and what she hoped for both of them, and that ended. I have not often found the world as good as I hoped it would be. In this I have been pleasantly wrong. That is your doing in part. Do not underestimate what you have made. Frances folded the letter and kept it in the top drawer with the earlier one, and attended the funeral in Wichita with Owen, and stood beside him in the cold cemetery with her hand in his, and James's hand in hers, and Alina on Owen's other side, too young to understand fully but old enough to be solemn. And she grieved with him the way you grieve with someone you love, which is different from grieving alone in all the ways that matter. The years moved the way years do when a life is working as it should, not imperceptibly, but with a satisfying momentum, each year containing more than the one before in the specific sense of more depth, more history, more of the layered knowledge of people you love in full. In 1890, James was 9, and Alina was 6, and the freight business had expanded once more, now with an office correspondence address in Wichita that Frances managed by post, and that made the operation more sophisticated than anything Owen had imagined when he painted the first modest sign in 1876. The sign outside the Caldwell building had been repainted twice since then, and it still said what it had always said: Keene and Doyle Freight. Honest rates. Those 2 words had become, over the years, a kind of trademark, something that clients mentioned when they referred the business to others, which they did consistently. Frances was 41 and Owen was 42, and they were, as Alina the younger frequently noted with the blunt authority of a child who has been paying attention to the adults around her, still disgustingly nice to each other, which she said with the tone of someone who disapproves, but does not actually disapprove at all. On an October evening in 1890, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the supper dishes were done, Owen brought 2 cups of coffee to the sitting room the way he had been bringing Frances coffee since the first evening in the office a decade and more ago, and they sat together in the lamplit warmth, and Frances opened the letter she had received that day from a freight company in Wichita that was proposing an acquisition, a buyout of Keene and Doyle at a price that was genuinely substantial. She had read it 3 times already. She handed it to Owen. He read it. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. She considered it. Not the money, which was real and good, but the question beneath the question, which was what she wanted her life to contain going forward, what she and Owen Keene, now Keene and Doyle in law as they had been in practice for years, wanted the next decade to look like. "I do not want to sell," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "I thought you might say that." "I thought you might say that too," he said. "I was right." She took the letter back and folded it. "We'll write back and decline." "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed. She set the letter on the table and picked up her coffee and leaned back in the chair and looked at the lamplit room, and the man across from her, and the life that was so thoroughly and specifically and honestly hers. And she thought of the day she had ridden into Caldwell on a roan mare with a bruised eye and $32 sewn into her coat, and no plan beyond the next town. And she thought of the sign on the narrow building, and the word honest, and the man behind the buried desk with his river-colored eyes. And she thought of everything that had assembled itself from those beginnings with the particular logic of things that were supposed to happen, and were nonetheless remarkable for happening. She did not say any of this aloud because she did not need to. Owen was watching her with his quiet attention and his warm, honest face, and he knew, the way he had always known, the way she had always known about him, that they were in the same thought at the same time and had been, reliably and without performance, for over a decade. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For being what you said you were," she said, "on the first day and every day since." He looked at her steadily in the way she had fallen in love with, completely and without ornament. "That was easy," he said. "You made it easy." She smiled at him, the full, genuine, uncalculated smile that she had been handing him more and more freely as the years made her less careful about protecting it, because he had never once used it against her, and never would. Outside, the October wind moved across the Kansas plains, and the town of Caldwell settled into its evening, and the 2 children slept in their beds upstairs with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children who are safe and known and loved, and Frances Doyle Keene drank her coffee in the lamplight and was home.